Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. Today's story about Mary and Martha is perhaps a familiar one to you. It's brief, but it quickly challenges a lot of assumptions and raises some questions. If anything, most of us are likely to take sides with Martha. I mean, she's the one doing all the work, right? And Mary is just sitting with Jesus without helping. Most of us can see value certainly in spending time with the guests, but if Martha is doing everything, running all around, shouldn't Mary have at least offered to help? And then when Jesus praises Mary for making a better choice and spending time with him, it seems almost unfair. On one hand, it's perfectly fine for Jesus to lift up the importance of someone devoting themselves to a guest and more specifically to his words. But at least for me, when I hear that on the surface, I wonder if that sounds maybe a little self-important or self-serving on Jesus' hand to say that. It's as if Jesus is saying, she was smarter to spend all her time with me. And I don't think he's really saying that with like a little humor attached to it. Okay, well, fair enough, but maybe Martha should be recognized at least for what she's doing as well. Understanding the context of this story, though, both in Luke's gospel as well as that culture, is absolutely key to seeing another layer of what's really going on here. This story immediately follows the parable of the Good Samaritan, which we explored last week. The Good Samaritan lifts up the importance of devoting ourselves to the neighbor, and not just any neighbor, but even the foreigner and those viewed with animosity. In that story, Jesus used a foreigner, a Samaritan, as the model for what a faithful person should look like. That represented a challenge to his disciples and listeners. In today's story, we're drawn into the home of Mary and Martha, and in it, Jesus highlights the corresponding importance of devoting ourselves to God. To be a disciple or student of a rabbi or teacher is important, but to make his point, he doesn't simply lift up one of his disciples as an example of this. Instead, he elevates the example of a woman, Mary. An old saying from rabbinic lore says, "Let thy house be a meeting house for the sages, and sit amid the dust of their feet, and drink in their words with thirst. But talk not much with womankind." That's very patriarchal, of course, and a bit offensive to our modern sensibilities, but this gives you some insight into the cultural and religious norms of that time. And yet, here's Mary. That old rabbinic lore was pointing to the image of a disciple sitting at the feet of a sage or rabbi to listen to them and learn. Here's Mary sitting at Jesus' feet and learning from Jesus like a disciple. She is assuming the role of disciple given to men in this society. Understand that it wasn't just Jesus who had disciples, but rabbis in general who assembled groups of disciples. Jesus is a rabbi. And so the role of a disciple wasn't limited to him or so unusual that people wouldn't understand the traditions and assumptions built up around that role. And so Mary is breaking with those customs quite openly. It's a gift and perhaps even a bit of a luxury to be able to sit at the feet of Jesus and talk. Martha is the one who is filling the typical role of a woman in that home by doing the work in the kitchen. If Jesus wanted to reinforce those traditional stereotypes, he would have found a way to gently redirect or reprimand Mary for sitting at his feet. Instead, he does the opposite. At Martha's protest, he affirms Mary and tells Martha that Mary has made the better choice. This isn't just a kind of self-congratulatory comment like Mary's paying attention to me, she's smarter. If we heard his comments that way, it might actually feel a little nauseating. No, it's a response to Martha's direct criticism of Mary, and it offers an opportunity for Jesus to redefine roles and affirm the place of anyone to be a disciple, including women. In this way, the two stories of the Good Samaritan and Mary and Martha complement each other. They illustrate the two greatest commandments that Jesus affirms just prior to this: love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. Both stories affirm one of those elements of being a faithful disciple: serving with compassion and devoting ourselves to the life and teachings of God. Jesus was not afraid to point out cultural customs and even certain religious teachings that failed to reflect the values and spirit of God. What are those customs and norms that fail to reflect God's spirit of hospitality and love today? Throughout the Gospels, we see examples of the disciples assuming that certain cultural and religious norms are in line with Jesus and his teaching. They push children away when they get too close because children are not seen with as much value in that time. They push away people who they deem ritually unclean or unworthy. They push away women. They're trying to embody what they assumed were proper holy attitudes. They talk of retaliation against foreigners and those who don't treat Jesus with respect. It's as if they see themselves as holy bouncers or gatekeepers, but Jesus regularly overrules them and rebukes them for these behaviors. We can see those same inclinations at work throughout history. People, in some cases with good intent, are trying to embody or even enforce religious codes because they think it's the right thing to do or the right way to live a holy life, and yet they find themselves actually standing against Jesus and God's Spirit. What are some of those pious judgments and attitudes that we are quick to enforce, but which we may need to re-examine today? What groups or people do you find yourself quick to judge or push out of God's way? Let us dare to listen to what Jesus has to tell us. We're called to join Mary and sit at his feet as learners and students, not to assume what he thinks, but to actually pay attention to his words and teachings. When we do so, we find that all are welcome to sit at his feet. Even Martha is invited to rethink her priorities. Maybe that's not something she wants to do, but her frenzied work is clearly stressing her out. Does it need to be this way? During COVID, despite all of its downsides, it did provide many people an opportunity to rethink how they wanted to live their life. Disruptions make us rethink priorities and commitments. Do we live to work, or do we work to live? Is life just an endless state of feeling behind on tasks and projects, of trying to dig out financially, of not living up to expectations and our perhaps perfect vision of how things should be? Or is life to be savored and enjoyed, to be spent in conversation and learning, in devoting ourselves, yes, to divine things? So often a worried and distracted mentality turns into frustration and anger. What if it could be different? There's no question that some moments call for us to be all in on the work at hand, in the same way that the Good Samaritan helped the man on the side of the road last week. But one of the things we learned about in the class that I led on Sabbath this past February was that when we're operating out of a place of greater calm and peace, we're actually more likely to make the right decisions and to be moral in our thinking. Back in the early 1970s, two behavioral scientists led a study at Princeton University on the psychology of moral behavior. They enlisted a large group of Princeton seminary students who were training for ministry. These were people who were starting with some degree of moral sensibility to begin with, obviously. The participants were told that they needed to prepare a brief talk about the Good Samaritan. Participants were all told that they needed to walk to a building across campus to meet up with another member of the team and then to give their sermon. By random, they were split into three groups. They were told one of three things. One group was told they had plenty of time and would be early. The second group was told that they were on time but should head over soon so they wouldn't be late. And the final group was told they were already late and really needed to get across campus quickly. It was all a setup. All the participants found a stranger in a narrow alleyway. The stranger appeared sick on the ground and in need of help. The catch was that the alleyway was only 4 feet across, so to avoid helping this man, you almost had to step over him. They collected information from all of the students in advance about their outlooks on life, their personalities, and typical things you might assume would factor into whether someone would help somebody in need or not. But in the end, none of those factors mattered. Who helped and who didn't perfectly followed how rushed they felt. In other words, if we're less frazzled, busy, and distracted, we are more likely to make positive moral decisions in the moment. And so Mary's quiet time spent at the feet of Jesus is not the opposite or alternative to helping the stranger or serving other people. Loving God and loving neighbor need not be seen as zero-sum alternatives with one taking away from the other. Either you work hard and help people, or you adopt a slower and contemplative spiritual approach to life. I think that's often the way we see love God and love neighbor, as two separate activities and states of mind. Either you're doing hard, concrete work, or you're just kind of unproductive and contemplative. At least in some respects, setting aside time for a more reflective and sustainable pace can actually make us better able to contribute in positive ways to our community and relationships. That's very counterintuitive for a lot of us. So often we assume that the people who are most effective work at a breakneck pace and push harder and harder. If busyness and pace negatively impact the moral decisions of an individual, then what does that mean about a whole society that is fixated on working faster and harder, and which values busyness as a sign that you're more effective or valued somehow? What if in the process of becoming busier and busier, we become less and less able to make basic moral decisions? To be clear, the Mary and Martha story has a simpler lesson. Jesus commends Mary for taking the time to show hospitality to Jesus and affirms her ability to sit at his feet and learn against the social customs of that day. But when we reflect on the importance of taking time for regular learning and reflection at the feet of Jesus, I do think we sometimes view that as a luxury. We don't have time for it, even if we value it. Like Martha, we do fill our lives with many other activities and priorities. Like with Martha, it's very likely that those activities are good things. They may even be activities that are commendable. Preparing a meal for a guest like Jesus seems like it would fit into the value system that Jesus would affirm, and I think it does. But it's not about some things being good and some things being bad. It's simply about whether we take the time to center ourselves and our souls in the timeless wisdom and teachings of God. Again, living as the Good Samaritan and as a disciple like Mary are complementary in the end. They are at the center of what it looks like to be a person of faith. We shouldn't lose touch with either element of the life of faith, but we should remember that in devoting ourselves to the presence and teaching of Christ, we rediscover the real Jesus, not the one we may assume. And in doing so, we find our humanity and the humanity of our neighbors. Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.